those who don't live in Canberra, in particular the Canberra political bubble, it's often hard to understand how science and policy are connected. And for us individually in our organisations, it's often hard to understand how one can start influencing policy decisions at government in ways which we think will be beneficial to our organisations, to science in general, and obviously in delivering benefits to the community. So the questions are, how does scientific thinking inform the way in which policy is formulated? How does scientific research and findings influence the decisions that are made at the highest levels? And how do policymakers set the stage for scientific work to be carried out? And I suppose in the end, how you can get your voice heard in that chain of events. So our next panel has, I think, a lot of the answers, if not all. Very experienced panel. And chairing the session is our own Kylie Walker, Chief Executive Officer of Science and Technology, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you. Good morning again. All of our panellists this morning are living proof. Do I have a mic? Yeah, okay. All of our panellists this morning are living proof that science and policy do mix. Each of them has a PhD in a STEM discipline, and each of them is a very senior public servant who applies scientific thinking and knowledge every day. All three of them are also incredibly generous with their time, and they make a lot of space in their diaries to speak to and learn from people in the sector. At Science and Technology Australia's own events, of course, at the National Youth Science Forum and at a range of other events and seminars. So, starting from my right, we have Professor Anne Kelso. She spent many years as a biomedical researcher in immunology and as a senior advisor on national and international councils and committees before she became CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council in 2015. Beside Anne, Shubho Banerjee has held a number of senior executive roles in the Australian Public Service and is currently DepSec of, I shouldn't use shortened language, should I? The Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education and Training, and he's also a physicist. And Alex Zielinski is Australia's Chief Defence Scientist, and he's also the head of the Defence Science and Technology Group. He started out as an engineer, and he spent some time leading a successful computer vision company before moving into government agencies. So please make them all welcome. So I'd like to start with a little bit of personal storytelling, if I may. Each of you has had a different path into public service, and I'd like to start by asking you briefly to tell us how you came to make the switch from a science degree or research to moving into a government agency. Anne, would you mind starting?
Thanks, Kylie, and good morning, everyone. I wasn't thinking about moving into government at all. I'd always said I'd never move to Canberra. And I just was at a point of thinking, well, it's time to think about what's next. And the job of CEO of NIHR came up. But when I first heard about it, I didn't even think about it. But somebody pointed out to me what an influential role it is in the health and medical research sector, and of course I believe in health and medical research, and it just perhaps almost over a weekend captured my passion, and I thought, yes, okay, I'll go for it. Big change, but a very exciting one. I don't have a moment of regret about making that move.
That was going to be my next question. What did you learn making that switch from working as a researcher to working at a major funding body? Really, you are, aren't you?
Well, naturally I was a bit nervous coming in. I was thinking, I'm just an academic, and what's it going to be like for these bureaucrats to have somebody like me come in and supposedly be their boss? And I guess the first thing I learned almost within minutes of walking into the agency was what incredibly strong support there was from our agency for me as CEO, because everybody is really working for the same goal. I had a real sense of people wanting to support me to be successful on their behalf and on the sector's behalf. I guess another thing I learned immediately was that I didn't have to do everything myself. And so there was really a lot of help from people who clearly have been in the public service for a long time, really understand the processes, understand the history, and have been helping me to survive and I hope thrive in that new environment.
Thank you. Shuba, I'm going to put you on the spot next. Can you tell us about how you came to be in the role that you're in after doing a physics degree?
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity to join the panel. I first started thinking about broader public policy when I was a PhD student, a physics PhD student, and my supervisor, Ken Baldwin's here today. I said hi to him previously, and I think he's going to speak a little bit later on. He encouraged me to be a bit more interested and involved in broader public policy issues. And the one that particularly, I guess, was on my mind was climate change. It really struck me so forcefully that climate change is an issue that is in many ways framed and defined by science, but relatively few people from a science background get involved in public policy and get involved in public policy advice. And so I started to pursue that, got more and more interested, in many ways found that I was suited to it, really enjoyed my professional life in public policy and have gone from there.
So do you call on your science training in your job now?
In some ways, I think in terms of my direct scientific knowledge, no, not really, but in terms of my broader interest, I think a scientific way of thinking about the world is an incredibly valuable intellectual training. It gives you a rigour that I think is unmatched. It is absolutely fantastic as a way of thinking about the world and thinking about problem solving. And then I guess the further thing that has stayed with me is just a broader curiosity about the natural world, and I find that that's incredibly helpful. It gives you an open mindset that's very, very helpful.
Alex, I think you've had perhaps a less linear path probably the least linear path on this panel to the job that you're in now. Could you give us a quick outline of what motivates you to go for the next job?
Yes, I was just listening to Anne and Subra, and I'm thinking, how can I add to that something interesting? I guess that when I did start off in my career, I started off as a cadet engineer for BHP back in the 70s, and coming from Wollongong was basically the only thing to work was, if you were born there, work at the steelworks or join the Australian Defence Force or something like that. There wasn't a lot of options, and in those days getting a cadetship to go and study at university was a good thing to do. So I didn't really think much beyond that, but once I got involved in a very large company like BHP, I understood the value of doing big things, and it's motivated me to try to make a difference, work on big things. So I ended up going into research and became a professor at the ANU, and I got there and I thought, well, I've now published my 100 papers, I've done this, and is it going to be just another 100 or so? And that then took me into thinking, well, what Australia needs is to really translate research into impact for society, for business, for the environment, a bit like what Subra was saying, and that drove me to setting up a company called Seeing Machines, in which we floated it on the London Stock Exchange, quite successful. And then I thought, well, okay, that was a small company. What could I do if I was involved in an organisation like CSIRO, which has got more resources and more people that you could motivate into doing science with impact? And that then ultimately led me to become Chief Defence Scientist. I could see that I could really have a greater influence there. And Defence, for instance, will be acquiring $195 billion worth of acquisitions of new technologies over the next decade, and that will all be informed by science. So to me, it's all about making a difference, thinking big.
And is thinking big, I wanted to ask you how you use your engineer's brain as you manage the DST group. I imagine there's a fair bit of administration involved. Do you have the opportunity to use those skills?
Well, I think it's very similar to, I'd say my role would be similar to a role of a vice-chancellor or something in a university. You've got a very skilled workforce, very clever people who don't like to take a lot of direction, and you've got to set the policy or motivate people to be pointed in the right direction, in a sense. So we've got big policy areas like the white paper or Next Generation Technologies Fund. So the idea is to have a influence over the broader strategy and let the creativity of scientists and technologists loose to work on the right problems.
You know, it's interesting thinking about creativity and imagination when you come to science and technology, because I think it's tempting to assume that there's, because of the framework, the rigour of the framework around it, that there isn't a lot of creativity. But of course, if you don't imagine what could be or start to ask questions about why, and those things are born from creativity, how on earth could you do research? Shubo, evidence-based policy, it's become a bit of a catchphrase. Is it a thing? What does it mean to you?
I definitely think it's a thing. I think to be careful about basing policy advice on rigorous and well-formed evidence is incredibly important. I think that one of the things that's actually useful and interesting for Science Meets Parliament is to think about what we mean by evidence, what the context is, how it relates to a question that's being formed, and what's involved in putting it together in the first place. So I am a very strong supporter of evidence-based policy, but I do think that it can be read into simplistic a form. It's very, very, very rare that the evidence pre-configures a decision. It's much more often the case that the evidence sets out the broad parameters which you then need to layer over social, cultural, economic impacts and think about how to weigh them up. And I think this idea that, on the one hand, that evidence isn't important is just completely misguided. I think evidence is always important to senior policymakers and to ministers and decision makers. But on the other hand, to think that evidence is conclusive is very rarely the case for the degree of complexity in real-world decision-making. And that's not a matter of bad faith. In complete good faith, it's very rare that a question is defined sufficiently narrowly that in some sense the evidence determines choice A versus choice B. It's much more common for decisions to require the layering on of a bunch of different considerations, which are legitimate considerations to be balancing up.
I want to draw a little bit on this idea of using evidence in the way that we formulate policy. I know, Anne, you've been looking at the evidence in your own agency over the last couple of years as you've gone through a review process. Can you talk us a little bit through how you've applied that kind of scientific thinking to that review process?
Well, to make what's first probably a rather trite comment is that I'll ask lots of questions about data. And we have, through our research grant management system, our database that anybody who's used it here will know is not a very easy one to use as an applicant, but it contains an absolute wealth of data about the people we fund, the career paths they take, because sometimes they have a fellowship with us, sometimes they have a grant from us. We know where they work because we deliver the grants to their institutions. And we know a lot about success rates in different schemes. We can analyse impact of gender, age, all sorts of different parameters. So we've got an extraordinary body of data that we can draw on just within our agency that we have there for the purposes of delivering grants. And that's a very strong guide to us in understanding what the current situation is and in trying to model the impact of any possible changes that we're now contemplating to the funding scheme. So that means it really is a data-driven process, and one that becomes more and more powerful as the programs for interrogating grant data become more powerful.
So I understand the review's gone up to the Minister. I'm not going to ask you to share confidential information at this stage, although obviously you're very welcome to if you wish.
Just between you and me.
Nobody will share it on Twitter or anything like that. What do you hope the review will achieve? What's been your goal?
Well, first of all, just a minor correction. It hasn't yet gone to the Minister. We've only just, that was a minor misreport earlier in the week from elsewhere. So we're at the stage where we've just taken it to our council a few days ago, and we're now preparing for talking with government about whether they support those changes and where we go from there. And in the meantime, we're also doing a lot of work on the detail, because we've had an external advisory group working up a model. They're made up of researchers from around the country, from different parts of the sector. We now need to think about how you turn that into practice. There's a huge amount of detail there. And as soon as we talk about what the changes might be, we know every researcher will want to know the answer to this question. So there's some work to do before we can go public. But I'm certainly hoping that we can make formal announcements quite soon.
And without letting the cat out of the bag, in 5 years' time, when you look back at this process, what is it that you hope to be able to say that you've achieved?
Somebody on our council, Brendan Crabb, said last week that he saw that just with one of the aspects of what we're proposing, every senior researcher, perhaps every researcher, would have an extra month a year. Now, that's a very simple parameter, but if you can streamline the way you call for and ask for grants so that people aren't putting in so many applications for an ever-dwindling number of grants, then you just automatically free up a lot of energy and time and money that's otherwise spent in putting forward and reviewing grants. So that's a very simple parameter. So we're looking to greatly streamline the major grant programs, reduce the effort that means for researchers and as applicants and as reviewers. We want to see a real stimulus for early and mid-career researchers. Now, gender equity is not a formal part of the review, although it feeds in all sorts of aspects of it, but that's a parallel incredibly important body of work to improve gender equity and health and medical research through our funding schemes.
I don't think anyone in this room is going to argue with those goals.
Good.
If you can achieve them, good for you. That would be wonderful. Your agency funds a lot of research. Alex, yours does a fair bit of research. How do you see the different government agencies that conduct research as fitting into the big picture politically and the broader STEM sector? So do you see the agencies as a bridge between the science and technology research and the government on the other hand, or outside of both of those sectors? A bit of a Venn diagram? How does it work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Kylie. I think it's actually the roles of where research agencies will do the work and how the rest of the innovation system, industry and academia, can contribute to national outcomes is blurring. Previously, you'd say, if you went back 10, 20 years, you'd say the bulk of the R&D dollars were spent in the national science agencies, be it CSIRO, ANSTO, DST, etc. Now that it's moved the other way, I think the minority is spent in these national science agencies. So you would have to say, okay, so the university and industry starting to spend its own money, that's outside of the government now. So the challenge for the government is to harness that, and to harness it in a way that is sort of directed to national goals, because at the end of the day, every university is pursuing its own research agenda and quality agenda. They're all trying to climb the league table of rankings, a very respectable activity to do. But it'd be good if you could do that, but also direct some of the work onto national problems that would actually make a difference to Australia, be it economically, socially, national security, or potentially in the environment as well. So we now are not only spending money to do our own work, but we're now spending money to partner with the academic sector. In fact, actually, as a bit of a plug, there's this document which is on your tables. That is actually a fund that the Minister of Defence Industry, Christopher Pyne, launched last week, a $730 million fund, and for next generation technologies, which is really a program to partner for the academic and industries with defence. So it's not a grant scheme, more like what we've got with NIHR. We think the way forward is for government agencies to work with academics, with industry together, not just be handing out money. The money's there to bring people together, but to work together in partnership to deliver the outcome.
Do you work with other government agencies as well?
Yes, certainly. We work with ANSTO, CSIRO, and the Bureau of Meteorology. So certainly there's a lot going on between those sort of science agencies, but also between whole of government in the national security space. So AFP, ASIO, all those agencies as well. They require innovation and science and technology. So it's about partnering and collaboration is the key going forward. No one can go it alone, I think.
It sounds like you're really a relationship manager.
Oh, that's interesting. You should say that. Yes, it's the other way to say it's a contact sport, and so it's you are constantly touching and reaching. It is the only thing is it is a lot more work. It's much easier to come along and just direct people to say, here's the money for your own team. But invariably, what we have today is no team that you have is the world's best team. There may be very good people, may have some world-class people, but there are other really equally good people in other institutions. So really the key is, it's imperative for us, is to harness the best team nationally and internationally if necessary to work on our problems.
Taking a slightly different tack, Jubo, is it possible for science and technology to set the policy agenda? As an example, just plucked out of thin air, we've been hearing a lot about energy lately. There are commercial solutions and there are political solutions being posed. What about scientific and technological solutions? Can science and technology drive that agenda?
Well, I think that's partly, it goes to your evidence question that we were just discussing last time around as well. I think if we start, science and technology is often critical in framing a problem, and even in the energy policy debate, as it's been discussed in the last few weeks, there have been substantial contributions from the chief scientist and indeed some broader expert work about what is technologically feasible, what is state-of-the-art, what are the more recent developments in battery or network design or various other things that go to what are the broad parameters within which we have to work, within which policy needs to be designed. Then from that you need to think about, well, what are the trade-offs underneath that constraint? And I think thinking about some aspects of design then come to other trade-offs that I was just talking about, economic, social, cultural, various other things. But the sense of thinking about the framing is really important. Within the trade-off, thinking about being expert in what is the state of the art about technology, what is the state of the art in terms of process engineering, what is the state of the art in what is possible, that's incredibly important, saturated with science and technology as well. But for complex public policy problems, they're almost always a mix of the technical, technological, and what I've described as economic, social, cultural or political.
So, for example, when the cervical cancer vaccine became available broadly and the government decided to fund a vaccination program for teenagers, was that decision based on a desire to reduce the amount of cervical cancer in society, or was it based on the availability of the mechanism to do so, or is it a bit of both?
Well, Anne might want to comment, but I would imagine it's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, you can't magic things out of thin air, so until there is a technique or a technology in that framing, you can't do it.
We could have done it with a non-technological solution, I suppose, by telling people to abstain. That's worked really well.
So it's always a mix of what is possible and then what can be done. But
Well, it's a really nice example because it illustrates how at least part of that policy decision will have depended on an analysis by a scientific and medical group, PBAC, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. So this is an independent committee advising government and the Department of Health, and it's made up of people who really understand the disease, understand the technology, and they are the group that advise the government on whether or not there should be subsidised medicines or vaccines or procedures alongside another one that's for medical services. So, I mean, it's a great example of where government has set up exactly the sorts of expert committees you need to advise on whether the technology is good, is it cost effective, does it make sense for it to be subsidised?
So I'm going to open up to questions from the floor in a moment, but while you all think about all of your very insightful and excellent questions, I I want to ask each of the three of you, if there was somebody here today who believes that their science or technology can and should change the way that we do something, the way that our policy is applied, how would they go about getting that change to happen? What's the best advice you can give them? No advice.
Just depends, really. If you really want to do a science for business, I think the startup community is really now starting to take shape. There are people now getting into business, and I'm really encouraged to see that Australia is now thinking about putting its PhD efforts into industry as much as it is to government academia. I think in Australia we've got exactly the reverse statistics of the US and UK and Europe, where 70% of their PhDs go outside of universities and into into industry and other ventures, while we have the opposite. So most of our graduates go back into the university sector. Not that that's a bad thing per se, but I think you're not getting the bang for the buck. So I'd say that there's challenging people to not think about just an academic career after you've done your PhD. Think about other things, maybe working in government or working in business. And to do that, you just have to be open to finding a course there, and that's how I'd leave it at that.
Mm. And
so thinking about the great idea that somebody might think should be taken up by government, presumably, I guess that's the question. I think the first thing is to understand why it would be attractive to governments. So it means talking to people and understanding it from a governance perspective. I think a great many people pitch to ministers and the Prime Minister all the time about more money should be spent on this or more money should be spent on that, or I've got the answer to your problem. And I think that where those sorts of pitches can succeed is where people have really taken the time to understand what government's needs are, what the politics as well as the policy implications are, what the costs would be, what the benefits would be. And I think that can be a stretch for the inventor or the academic, and it does mean learning a lot about a part of the world that one might not otherwise investigate.
Mm. So asking questions, I suppose, and connecting with people who do know how it works.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd strongly endorse that. I think one of the reasons that I always like to come into Science Meets Parliament is I think the first step is to really take the time to understand the process and respect the process. On the science side, there is rightly an expectation that people will respect the process of science and understand what peer review means, understand what generation of scientific knowledge means, why it has a particular truth claim. All of these things are extremely important, but they require a degree of engaging with the process and understanding the process. What I really like about this event is you're taking the time to engage with the broader policy and political process, and you need to do that in a respectful way. You need to understand exactly the stuff that Anne was just talking about. You need to understand that people pitch to politicians all the time, absolutely all the time. And I'd actually go one step further back than Anne. If you've taken the time to actually think about why it might be of interest to the politician, then already you've taken a step further than a lot of people have. A lot of people pitch on the basis of what they're interested in, not what the person they're pitching to is going to be interested in. And that just strikes me as really, we're not even thinking about the basics here, right? We're having a human interaction and we're talking on the basis of what I'm interested in rather than what you're interested in. I mean, that I think is a start. Then I think understanding a bit of process from there of how much of this is about government, how much of this is broader public support, how much of this is funding, how much of this is broader institutional support. There's all these different bits of it that you need to respect the process enough to understand how you connect to it. And I guess as an unashamed pitch for Science Meets Parliament, the good thing about this is there are lots of different relationships, there are lots of different conversations, there are lots of different layers to this that are worth exploring, but you can't really figure out which bit of it is of particular interest to you until you become a bit literate in the whole show. And one of the advantages of Science Meets Parliament is it gives you really an unparalleled exposure to the whole of the show so that you can figure out which bit of it might be particularly relevant to you.
I'm going to film you saying that, and then I'm going to use you in my promotional material for next year. Thank you very much. I think we do have a couple of questions. I'm just going to move up here so that I can see everybody before we do that. So I think Diane had a question over here to start.
My name is Diane Jolly. I'm from the University of Wollongong. So thank you so much for people today for mentioning Wollongong so much. We do exist. I'm really quite interested. So all three of you have mentioned various aspects of research and connecting with industry and connecting with the target audience. One of my questions is, from my research group and experience and the academics, at what stage is an idea ready to be pitched? When is it ready to be applied in a grant? When is too soon? Perhaps when is too late? And at what stage are you interested really in talking to people about these ideas?
I think it depends very much on what your goal is. So in the medical research area, I suppose you could think you might have a brilliant idea for a new drug, and so how far can you get down that pathway on your own in the development of that idea and the proof of concept of the drug. If you're like most people working in a university, you'll be at a pretty early stage of that research, and that's too soon to be talking to government. It's too soon to be talking to me. It's a point at which you want to engage with how to get with collaborators or industry who might be able to get you to the next step. But if you're working in an area where you have evidence for a policy that should in fact soon be scaled up by government, you really are at that point. That is the time to be talking to the Department of Health or the Department of whatever that's relevant to your work. So I doubt that there's a single answer to the question. I'm thinking it depends very much on what the goal of the work is and what the pathway is for getting that to the next stage and ultimately implemented. I'm not sure if that's helpful because it's very vague.
I mean, again, completely agree. The extra flavour I'd put on that, though, is if you're looking for a collaboration or a connection, you're looking for some form of mutual connection around that. And in terms of talking to government, it's helpful to have a sense that you're helping to solve a problem that someone's actually interested in, or you're answering a question that someone's asking. And so now I say that in absolute full respect of a whole bunch of research that is useful to be completely curiosity-driven and to be researcher-driven. Of course, that's incredibly important. I'm massively respectful of that. But the bit that we're talking about here, which is more a pitch, when you're pitching, you've got to have a sense that you're answering a question that's been asked. And in a sense, the earlier you can talk to people about what questions they're asking, the better. And so that then comes from a degree of trust and relationship and connection and how the broader web and network works. If you know people well enough to have relatively early stage informal conversations that come to, well, these are the kinds of things I'm thinking about, they can be incredibly helpful early in the piece because they can help shape a further collaboration. When I was doing the science policy job in the industry department, over and over again, the most successful industry-university collaborations were really fueled by very early stage conversations which helped to shape the problem together. And really that's the experience over and over and over again, that some form of helping to set the question helps to ensure that you're actually then thinking about something that is directly relevant and useful. And that's not the same thing as somehow dictating the answer. Really working hard with people about a question, an academically rigorous question, an independent question, in no way prescribes the answer. But this is more your space, Alex, I think.
I don't know, I think you've done a very good job there, Subro and Anne, I don't think there's much to add. Look, I think if I went back to sort of the very first principles of what you want to do here, it's always to seek to be the best in what you're doing and to be recognised for that, because that gives you authority to speak. And so by all means, work with the best people you can, publish in the best journals you can. If you've got a technological result, patent it. So you lay down these elements that you really are a leader in your field, and you've got credibility and credentials. And that also brings you to the table that if you are recognised as an expert on an area and internationally recognised even better, that actually helps you to do the things that Subro and Anne were saying.
We had a question over the side of the room, thank you.
Yes, I'll be brief. It's really a fascinating conversation at the moment. I note that we're moving away from the old evidence-based policy trope to one which is, I think, much more productive, which is about framing, about knowledge, and about timing. I think that we should really take evidence off the table in this discussion because it has two quite different meanings. One is data-driven, and the other one is really about knowledge. Scientists deal with an indefinite future and an indefinite past. Politicians deal with the immediate future. But we have a crossover. Normally, people advising government don't deal with the moral basis of decisions. That's the job of the politicians. We've had a crossover with politicians basically taking up the idea of numbers-driven decisions, and scientists are left with the moral decisions about if we continue going this way, we're going to be in big trouble. I'll just leave that as a comment, but I would like maybe a comment from Shuba, because I picked up a statement he made about it is rare that evidence pre-configures a decision. I thought that was fascinating, and maybe he can elaborate.
Sure, happy to have another crack around evidence-based policy. Let me start by saying I think starting with the evidence is incredibly important, and being respectful of state-of-the-art knowledge and talking to experts, looking at data and trying to understand how a problem is set up is absolutely crucial. So I just want to be unequivocal about that. But then from there I want to offer a slightly more personal, professional reflection. We mentioned in the introductions my background's in physics. I was struck as I moved on to public policy how little of my physics background had thought about the structure of knowledge and what evidence actually means. And so I mean this as someone who is absolutely in the firm objectivist physics camp. There is a natural world worth discovering that has a bunch of facts that can be discovered by sufficiently rigorous scientific work. But we don't think nearly enough about what the structure of knowledge is. What does it mean to have a truth claim that is better than someone else's truth claim? This is actually a subtle and interesting question, and we go too quickly as physicists to some form of, well, this truth claim is better because I'm objective, rather than really thinking through, well, what does it mean to be objective? What does it mean to go through peer review? What does it mean to be tested? And in extremely politically contested environments, that structure of knowledge question becomes absolutely crucial, because there are differing views that each try and claim the mantle of scientific authority, and often from a science background, we haven't thought enough about what makes something more likely to be right than something else. We fall back on kind of glib forms of scientific method, scientific authority, objectivity, instead of thinking about, well, what does it mean to grapple with uncertainty? What does it mean to advance knowledge over time? What does it mean to have consensus or strength through peer review? These are subtle and interesting questions, and I offer them up from a physics background of someone that is absolutely invested in the scientific enterprise. Nonetheless, these are important things to think about, because when you are dealing with very politically contested areas, these things matter. These things matter a lot. And unless you think very carefully about the basis on which you are making claims, then it's hard to really give the proper foundation in evidence that we should be able to give. So all of this is a way around of saying evidence is incredibly important, but it's only persuasive if we've thought really carefully about why it's persuasive and why it matters.
Thank you. Ken has been waiting patiently.
So we've heard a lot about how scientists should, step up to the plate and provide evidence and be a participant and all the rest of it. But I think there's also an element of our political leaders stepping up to the plate as well. And now that the chief scientist left the room, I'll talk about energy. So energy is a perfect example of this. People have been saying for a long while, and I remember actually saying this very thing in this very room to a COAG Energy Ministers meeting, that there's a science and technology train and it's going to roll over us unless we catch it and do something about it. And this has caused a revolution in our energy systems. It's, renewables, battery storage, complexity, all these things. And we've been saying this for years. And yet nobody has really picked this up and run with it. Worse than that, there's been both pushback and uncertainty because of competing agendas, climate change, all these other things, which has meant that policy decisions in the national interest, which require long-term decision-making, just haven't happened. And yet scientists have really stepped up to the plate in this regard and been telling the government that they really need to do something. Why is it that we're not cutting through? And why is it that politicians shouldn't step up to the plate as well?
I knew there was a question coming. Alex?
Okay, I'll have a go at this. This is just my opinion, okay? So I actually think that you get this issues where, this train wreck, or the way you put it, occurs when we don't have bipartisan support and where politics are being played out at federal, state, government versus opposition, and energy policy has been one of those contested areas for more than basically the last decade. In other areas where you have bipartisan support, it's much more straightforward, and I'd like to think that defence and national security is one area that has now got complete bipartisan support, and we often end up briefing the opposition on what we're doing. The government wants to make sure that they're doing things. For example, the future submarine, it's going to be a $50 billion acquisition for Australia, a lot of new technology. You want to make sure that the opposition, if they get to government, which they will one day, the governments do change, and you want to make sure that they support a 50-year program. And so it can be done, but I think you're looking at areas where there is non-partisan, it's actually divided across multiple dimensions. And when it's contested, very hard for science to cut through, and in the end it's almost, you have to go through the brutal realities of life, and then that brings people to the table, and then hopefully common sense prevails. But maybe my colleagues have got another view on this. So, yeah.
Well, I think those were very wise comments from Alex. I'm just trying to think in the health area, something that I think is a revolution that's in the process of rolling over us, and a huge opportunity, and is, I think, at the moment, not something that's politicised, and that is the data revolution. The opportunities from electronic health records linked to other sorts of health records, like which drugs are used and which medical services are used, to understand how to improve the health of the community, to improve the treatment of each patient, as well as to guide government policy about how resources should be directed. And then the related what's been called the democratisation of medicine, through us all having something around our wrist that tells us what our heart rate is and how many steps we walk today, and the fact that we can begin to take responsibility in a new way for our own health and health care. Now, this is a very exciting time, and it is going to lead to a very different way of thinking about how we deliver health services across the country. And it hasn't yet had a lot of public debate. But the critical thing in there that has the potential to politicise it and make it of concern instead of an opportunity for the community is concerns around privacy and the potential for data leakage. And so some of the things that have happened already with government data leakage undermine what could be a very important step forward. So I think this is an area that is not yet really politicised, but I hope one that we can, as a country, get right before it's too late and other countries have leapt ahead and have better healthcare than we have.
I think there are a few people in this room who are working in that very area, actually, so perhaps there will be a few conversations on the Hill tomorrow about that. I have a question from my far left.
Hi, my name's Gemma Anderson. I'm an astronomer at Curtin University. Dr. Zelensky said that there was this sort of disconnect between university and the science created at university and policy. In relation to we need to work more with industry. So being at a university, it really is a case that you only learn about academia and how to sort of keep going in academia, and we don't really hear much about what options there are to move outside of academia. It's quite difficult for a lot of people to make that transition. So I'm just wondering how we can encourage universities to work more with industry and to help people who are in academia to actually, make that sideways step and not to feel that it's a backward step, but a new opportunity as well.
Okay. All right, so if I could probably clarify my remarks, I think that what I was trying to say is that we're not really harnessing the power of the universities as much as we could to the national efforts. And that's actually occurring not just to government but also to industry. I think the previous chief scientist, Professor Chubb, published this report where Australia was in the OECD rankings of collaboration between industry and academia, and Australia was ranked at 33 out of 33. That was at the lowest end. We were lower than, I can't remember all the countries that were there, but the OECD, so you can imagine where we were sitting at the end. So, and look, that's not just, a lot of industry people say it's because the universities aren't wanting to engage. It's not true, actually. Australia has got a very uncollaborative culture in terms of R&D between government, to industry, government, or industry to academia, and backward to academia to government. So that's one of the things that we've recognised, and that's part of our strategies to drive that and to put real money on the table for collaboration and to start to change the behaviours. Because unless we start to work together, we'll not get the results. And I think once industry has a better understanding of what can be done, I think this is very good. Now, there's a guy I saw earlier today, Jeff Prince. Are you here, so Jeff? Yeah, Jeff's got a program that he's starting up through AIMS, which is about putting PhDs, 1,400, into industry over the next 3 years. That's an excellent initiative. We need more of that.
Anne?
Yeah, thanks, Kylie. We're aware in NHMRC that one of the drivers against people collaborating with industry is their concern that they won't have as many high-impact publications, that they'll be less competitive from grants from NHMRC and ARC. So we're really looking internally at our policies about how to get better recognition of industry collaboration through the assessment of track records, and how to give applicants guidance on what to tell us about their engagement with industry so that peer reviewers can value it. So we've made a step in that direction this year by putting out guidance on exactly that issue, but we're thinking also more broadly about how we can promote a culture of interest in and improve commercial literacy. I think the funders do have a role to play here.
Absolutely. Shubo, I'd assume that you've got an opinion on this issue as well.
Probably not beyond what's already been covered. I think I'm certainly interested in mobility, and I'm struck by just how difficult it continues to be. I think Anne and Alex are still rare examples in terms of mobility, and it would be good to think about better pathways and making that easier in and out, so it's not a kind of once and for all decision to move between sectors. I think that's still very, very difficult. I think it's in some ways easier to move into government because some of our kind of recognition of prior experience is a bit easier. I think it's harder to move back into academia, is what I hear.
Absolutely. We've only got time for a couple more questions, so I'll ask you to refrain from commenting and just stick to an actual question.
Tim Omar is my name. I'm with industry. I work for General Electric, the large US multinational company. So my question is around engaging industry in innovation policy, in science policy. I think as a nation, sorry, I'll stop the comment. I just love your feedback on that. We're doing great stuff, but we think we could be doing a lot more.
Who wants to jump in on that one?
I think in principle,
she nearly made it.
There is an enormous appetite for greater connection and collaboration and a degree of co-design around a lot of these initiatives. I think Alex has already gone to some of the initiatives that are underway in terms of trying to put different incentives into that to try and bring forward further collaboration. It's not for any lack of desire to do better in that space, I think.
Anne, I think you had something to say there.
Simply to say that we have a number of industry people who are advising us at NHMRC on what we can do to improve the commercial literacy, to improve the incentives for people to collaborate with industry. So it is something that we see as an agency being very important. We will continue to be a funder of public research, but we want to be able to support people across that full spectrum, from discovery through to engagement with end users, whether it's industry like companies like your own, or whether it's industry in the sense of health service delivery.
And Kathy, finally, just behind you.
Sorry, my name's Kathy Foley and I'm STA Policy Advisor. I just want to ask a question about the calls for submissions by government. You know, we had the one from your department, Sibo, about NCRIS and the road mapping. There was a Defence White Paper request for submissions. I'm just curious to know whether they're useful, whether they have impact, and whether they're worth the effort.
Good question.
They're certainly taken very seriously in processes that I've been involved in or had some association with. I think, again, I'm really interested in what is the question and is this an answer to the question that we're asking. I do think that submissions that range very broadly, provide a whole bunch of background information, are less likely to have impact than things that really get to really what is the underlying question that government's looking to solve, or what are we trying to really address here. I certainly read submissions with an eye to, tell me something I hadn't thought of before, or tell me something I hadn't thought about it in that way, that kind of thing, rather than a kind of further, I guess, rerun of a broader range of background information. I think I'd go back to, we were talking before about the pitch, whether it's to politicians or to public servants. There's a lot of pitching on the basis of this would be good for me. I think a bit more of this is why it would be good for the question that's being asked, or this is why it would be good for the country as a whole. That would be helpful. So again, just stepping out a little bit from yourselves in making submissions and thinking about, well, what are we really trying to address? So I think, Kathy, the short answer is they are read, they're considered carefully. There are processes and processes. Some of these are more detailed, some of them are at a higher level. I'd say the overarching principle is still, have you brought something to the table that perhaps brings a new perspective or brings a different way of thinking about it? That's always very striking. But I think it is also important to put stuff on the record as well. It's important to say, and it goes a bit to some of the other comments around the room, this is a way of framing the problem. This is what the broader evidence says. This is how you can think about it.
So I'm glad you made reference very quickly to the putting something on the record bit at the end, because I suspect a lot of organisations do reiterate existing policy in order to have something on the record, rather than necessarily materially adding to the review or the consultation that you're managing. And having just managed a process like this one, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was thinking on top of what Subo has just said, which in my own much more limited experience is exactly right. The other thing that can be incredibly helpful and doesn't happen very much in my experience of submissions is people really looking ahead. So in addition to people mostly talking about their current status and what they want, we can be inviting a futuristic look and really get nothing back, so that it's putting it back on people, on a very small number of people, to really try to look ahead 10, 20, 50 years. And yet there must be a huge number of people who do think about the future, who do have ideas to contribute about how things could be better in the longer term. So look ahead, not just to the present.
Great advice, thank you. We're about to wrap up, but just one final question for each of you, and I'd like you all to have a bit of a go at this one. I'm sure that there will be a very easy answer. So we're hearing a lot today and tomorrow about the importance of people in STEM speaking with the decision makers in politics, but what about the decision makers in policy? How would you approach your organisation from the outside? Alex?
Right to me.
Right, directly to you.
But yeah, absolutely. I deal with people all the time who come to me, and in the end we do direct them. But there is actually now a Defence Innovation Portal where a lot of programs are put. But I'm certainly, as a leader in the government, expected to be able to deal with questions around defence, science and technology and opportunities. I think that I prefer that you come to me first rather than going to my minister and asking for some funding or a program, and which generates a lot of work for everybody. So I think most departments have a public-looking face these days. They've been streamlined. There are portals. That's the first place they go. But if you don't know who to go to in defence and you want to talk to science and technology, come to me.
Shubo, your department?
Oh, look, I was reflecting on a few of the things that have been said through the panel. Firstly, some of the stuff I've been saying before I go to the stuff from Alex and Anne, I'm particularly interested in the question, the impact, what is it that you're trying to tell me? And so I think that sense of a bit of sharpness about that. Now, that can come in many different forms. We'll have drinks and dinner tonight. You'll get the chance to talk to a whole range of different people. They will be interested in the work that you do because it's the work that you do. That's a great start, right? They'll be interested in your science. That's fantastic. But from that, why is your science of interest to them? Like, what is it that you're bringing that sparks a bit of an interest? So I guess I'd come to a bit more sharpness in the pitch, a bit more of, well, why is this of particular interest, apart from the many, many hundreds of other things that you might be hearing this week, this month. The sharpness in pitch. Next, making connections really makes an enormous difference, and Alex was talking about that. I think the broader ecosystem of getting to know people at different levels, getting to know people that are working on different things, and so having a sense then of why something might be of particular interest is incredibly important. And so take the time to do that, take the time to try and build some relationships, take the time to be a bit curious about other people and what they might do. I think that bit of it really resonated for me. And then from what Anne was saying before, I think the sense of, have a sense of the path. What is it that you're starting from? Where are you trying to get to? What's your credibility in that space? Why have you got something that is really useful and fantastic? And so I think all of those come together with a sense of these are complex relationships, complex webs of kind of influence and getting to know the broader science policy space. Take the time to learn a bit more about it, including in the next couple of days.
And Anne, how do people reach out to the NHMRC? If I'm not talking about applying for grants, but...
And we do have a complaints process. We get plenty of those.
Presumably, if you might want to reach out to you and not complain.
Yes, unfortunately, there are lots of people who don't just want to complain. And a lot of people get in touch either directly with me or in writing to the NHMRC who want to discuss some aspect of what we do and how to work together or how to get more funding into an area of interest to them. And I think the most important thing for people seeking to engage with us in that way, in that very positive way, is to think about the context, is to understand what NHMRC is there for, and to see it more broadly so that the pitch can fit into that bigger picture. If it seems like a purely self-interested pitch that takes no consideration of the wider world of what NHMRC is there for, which is the improvement of human health through research, then that's less likely to be a satisfactory discussion, I think.
Well, I think there are some salutary lessons here from your furious agreement on the panel. So Professor Anne Kelso, Dr. Shubo Banerjee and Dr. Alex Zielinski, thank you very much for joining us today, sharing your time and your wisdom.